This is Leslie Street Spit. It's a long peninsula that was created from the rubble from the city of Toronto. So all the building materials that was clean basically was put into this long spit that sticks out way into Lake Ontario. And in the background you can see they're doing more construction. So the landfill, that's clean landfill, instead of sticking it into a garbage dump, you're using it as fill, and they're creating more habitat heterogeneity on the shoreline. They've lost a lot of wetlands along the edge of Toronto because of hardscaping and concrete, and so now they're adding more of that habitat heterogeneity back in, and you can see the scaping that they have. So they're creating a bunch of different bays, and behind that is filling with clean topsoil from construction sites. And rather than putting it in the landfill, they're putting it in here. So they're filling in behind that, and some of that will become wetland, some of that will become upland, so creating that habitat heterogeneity. And what I'm standing on right now is actually all landfill as well. And topsoil was added on top of this, and then native species were planted back into it. And so it's actually quite a nice place to visit, because there's quite a diversity of different species out here, different wildflowers and different grasses and different trees that are native to the area. And then you have all your birds and your butterflies and that sort of thing. And they're using this peninsula as a jumping off point for the migration. So you're actually getting a migration funnel going across Leslie Street Spit, because it extends out into Lake Ontario. So a lot of the wildlife going from northern Ontario funnel through Toronto, and originally it was a much richer habitat, and that's one of the reasons you built Toronto here, because it had such a nice rich habitat for different species, and so you could farm and you'd hunt those species. And so the indigenous communities were here originally, and then when the Europeans came, they took over this area. It was rich, and then over time most of that richness has been destroyed because the city expands and your techniques have changed and you've paved over everything. So now we need to go back in and reinvigorate the area for biodiversity. So adding these different peninsulas out into the lake creates that sort of a different area. It creates sheltered areas for not only the boats and for shipping, and creating little harbor areas that are safe from the wave action of the larger lake, but it also creates habitat for fish and ducks and that sort of thing to get out of the weather of the main lake. This is Lake Ontario, one of the Great Lakes, and on this side it's open to the lake, so you have a lot of wave action hitting the shore, and you can see most of the organic matter is taken away, and you can see what this long spit is made of. So this is all the construction material from the city of Toronto, and you can see the rebar in here and the chunks of concrete. But then as you go through here, you can see how they've restored this ecosystem. So there's too much wave action over here, but once you get up to this point, then there's enough soil that you can have vegetation, and so it's become revegetated, some of it on its own, some of it being planted, and it just has a large variety of species. But you're working with extremely harsh conditions. Not only are you having the wind and the waves from the lake that are going to be blowing here all the time, so you need fairly hardy species that are going to occur out here, but also the substrate you're working with. You can see how much concrete there is mixed in. Maybe there's a few bricks and different things, but there's not a lot of nutrients in the soil, so they've had to come in and put in on a layer of topsoil. The topsoil obviously is expensive, so they didn't put very much. And so they're allowing the natural regeneration process to occur. But a lot of the species that are occurring here are invasive species. So they're allowing that process of naturalization to occur and allowing the soil to slowly develop over time. And gradually over time they're managing and trying to shift this ecosystem towards a more healthy ecosystem. So reducing the amount of invasive species, increasing the plantings of native species, and allowing for some species to come in by birds and different things like that, because there's a lot of birds that move through this area, so they want to have food sources for those birds moving through. So this is a very challenging environment to work with. Another thing that's interesting here was you can see that we've actually got beavers. So looking down here, this is a good example of the beavers cut this off. Oops, move that aside. The beavers cut off that poplar tree. And over here you can see there's another one that's been cut off and how it's been coppiced. And so all these new poplar shoots are coming out from the base. And then those multiple shoots, one of them will become dominant over time. But then it's also more beaver food. So they're kind of stimulating the environment and changing it for what they need by coppicing these different trees. And these poplars will send out runners, and then they'll pop up new ones, and it'll gradually help restore the habitat. So not only in small ponds that beavers are creating, but the beavers are actually on this spit, and they're changing the environment as well by coppicing the poplar and eating different plants and shifting it more towards a healthy ecosystem. So they're ecosystem engineers not only in ponds but in other aquatic habitats as well. In this area of the peninsula, lovely street, you can see we've got open water here, and then you've got concrete up on the edge. But down in this zone, you can see it's a bit of a bay, and so it's accumulating sand and accumulating small rocks. But most of this is broken down concrete and broken down bricks. So you can see from this larger piece, it's a conglomerate. This is originally concrete, and then these pieces were originally brick. So over time, this has probably been here 20, 30 years, breaking down the concrete and the bricks, and gradually it's restoring a more healthy ecosystem with the wave action that's constantly breaking this up. So you're creating these different zones of pulling away the rocks and the sand from different areas. And then in shallower areas, in bays, it's accumulating. Because it's a little calmer area here, we've got things like ducks coming in and feeding in the shallow areas. There's probably little insects on the bottom that they're feeding on, different plants. And so you're creating these different ideal habitats for recolonization. And you can see over there that was a high activity area, so there wasn't a lot of organic matter. But here on the shoreline, see where it's eroded through here. You can see all the rock and rubble, but then there's also this organic layer that's starting to build up here. All this woody debris coming in from the lake, being deposited in lines. Over time that's going to break down and start creating more of a shoreline here. You could probably even come in the next little while and start adding things like beach grass and beach species to this ecosystem to help kickstart it and move it in that direction. So this little area is starting to become a little beaver forest, as you might. These coppiced main trees are sending up tons of suckers, but they're also sending out little suckers off to the side. Wherever the roots come up to the surface, they're sending up new shoots. So you may have started out with one poplar, and then it's sent out multiple others, and then the beavers come in, chopped off the main stem, and it sends out multiple suckers for coppicing. And said over time you're going to get a bit of a poplar stand here, and the beavers doing that as part of the ecosystem engineering process. Further out on this spit, in the Leslie Street spit, we have what's called wetland cells. So along the outside, they've built up all the concrete as a barrier for the wave action, but then inside these cells, what they've done is they've dredged material out of the channel so that they can have shipping access, and they've deposited, instead of dumping it into the lake, and some of that could have toxic material in it, they've dumped it into these wetland cells. And so they're actually fairly deep, and so they built up a layer of that sediment, and then they put a cap over top of it of clay, and then they've allowed the vegetation. They've gone in, they planted thousands of wetland species into this area and re-established it as a wetland. And you can see along the edges, we've got your upland areas that are on the higher rocky areas, and then coming down you can see that zonation of emergent species, and then in the water you're seeing the aquatic species. And within that habitat you can see they placed a lot of woody material, so they're creating habitat within that wetland for ducks, for turtles, for fish that come in there. And then they've also got poles that are sticking out vertically, and those are perch poles so that the birds can land on there, drop seed, and they can have a better view of the area. So they're adding all these different elements. There's also bird boxes, so various bird boxes for many different birds, and creating more heterogeneity. Instead of just leaving it smooth and making a big square, they're trying to have a lot more undulation in here so that you have more habitat. So in terms of carbon capture, the aquatic species accumulate a lot of carbon very quickly because they produce a lot of biomass. They don't have to worry about water because they're in an aquatic environment, so they can just grow like crazy. And what happens is, as the aquatic material dies and falls to the bottom of the pond, it falls into an anoxic zone where very low oxygen, and so the microbes can't break the material down as fast, and so you quickly develop a very dark, rich black muck at the bottom of these ponds, high in nutrition. And you can see all the vegetation that's out there, and the ducks are out there, and there's all sorts of aquatic insects, and there'll be fish as well in here as well. Obviously they don't come on their own, they'll have to be brought in by birds bringing in the eggs, and frogs. There's tons of frogs in here. Some of the challenges that are faced, well, as you can see, it's a low water year. You can see a lot of exposed mud flat, and so with global warming this area could dry up. It's managed, so they would probably just pump some water back into it in one of these cells, so they have the ability to do that and bring water in from the lake because it's right beside. But if this was a natural system, it could dry up completely if it doesn't have any water. Fortunately, aquatic species are fairly well adapted, and they can take long periods where it's fairly dry, so they're used to this up and down motion of the water throughout the year, and so they've adapted that survival strategy, being able to tolerate really dry and being able to be submerged for periods of time as well. So other challenges are things like Phragmites. I know they've come in here and they've done a lot of control on Phragmites. A lot of the areas around the shoreline, there was large swaths of Phragmites, and that was taking over this ecosystem, and they had to come do some fairly aggressive management to bring it back under control. Once they did control it from the seed bank, because they had put in hundreds of different species into the ecosystem, that seed bank was still there, and so when you remove the Phragmites, then all of those species came back up again, and what you're seeing is a healthy wetland after the control of Phragmites. So it's really important to consider your management options when you're doing it. If you had let this go into Phragmites, the Phragmites would have probably taken over most of the wetland habitat, and you would have much lower biodiversity. And we even find things that, because Phragmites is so dense, that things like turtles, can get stuck within them and then they die. And so just making a healthy habitat and being a good steward of the land is extremely important. Maintaining the level of biodiversity that's there, because in places like Toronto, this is a false environment, and so you've got a huge array of invasive species that could impact this. But managing it keeps it in a very healthy state.